This is Entertainment for Review, and as we approach the Halloween season, it is time to start another horror review series, and this year I'm going to be reviewing all of the movies in the Friday the 13th franchise. One of my favorite horror franchises, starring everyone's favorite hockey mask-wearing, machete-wielding killer, Jason Voorhees. This series contains 12 movies and 2 TV series, including a new one called Crystal Lake, which will be debuting later this year. Now for this series, I will be reviewing 11 movies. The only one that will not be getting reviewed in this series is Freddy vs. Jason, which contains both the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street franchises. So I'll wait till both franchises have been fully reviewed until I bring them together and review Freddy vs. Jason at a later time. And for today's review, we are going to get started with the 1980 horror classic that started it all, Friday the 13th. And please be aware that if you have not seen this movie, that this review will contain spoilers. Friday the 13th for me is a genre-defining horror movie. It came out during a time period where there were a lot of big franchises just getting their starts, and a lot of movies would follow in this one's footsteps. Now, broken down to its most basic elements, this movie is a movie about a murderer out for revenge, terrorizing a summer camp on a lake. But this movie does have some more complexities than that, and even has a bit of a supernatural element to it. The movie starts way back in summer of 1958, where we see a glimpse of the camp at that time, and we see that somebody is kind of stalking around the camp, and they eventually come across 2 counselors who have gone off on their own to have some amorous activity, and they are both then killed. We then immediately jump to the modern day of the time, which was 1980, and someone has decided to reopen the camp, and that is the Christies. And we see one of the new counselors walking through town and trying to find their way to the camp. They stop in a diner and ask for directions, and a local man is offered up to give her a ride, at least part of the way. One thing we learn early on is that the townspeople refer to Camp Crystal Lake as Camp Blood, because of what's happened there in the past. She has a run-in with a townsman named Crazy Ralph, and he warns her not to go to the camp, and she might never come back.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you?
God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get. Leave people alone.
You'll never come back again.
Now, the gentleman giving her a ride says that he's kind of crazy, but he also takes the opportunity to give her a warning as well as some more back history for us about this camp. He says that a boy drowned at the camp in 1957. Now that, as we would later learn, is Jason Voorhees. And 1 year later, in 1958, 2 camp counselors were killed. He also notes that the camp tried to reopen a couple of times over the years, and each time something prevented it, and there was more mischief at the camp. He referenced fires and the fact that 1 year the water was bad. None of this seems to faze Annie. She just continues on her way to the camp when he drops her off at the midway point that they had predetermined. 3 other counselors, Jack, Marcy, and Ned, arrive at the camp. Jack is notably played by Kevin Bacon, who is probably the biggest success to come out of this movie. This is one of his earliest roles. They meet the boss of the camp, Steve Christie, and there are some other counselors already present, Alice, Bill, and Brenda. They're all there to get the camp set up a few weeks ahead of the campers' arrival, and Steve quickly puts everybody to work. It's clear that Steve has an interest in Alice right off the bat. He leaves them all to continue their setup and heads into town. And they do note that Annie, who is scheduled to be the cook, has not arrived yet. We then do catch up with Annie, who is still walking towards the camp, and she's trying to hitchhike, and she sees a Jeep approach, and she flags them down, and they let her in. We never get a good look of the driver of the Jeep as they make their way around, and Annie becomes alarmed when they do pass the turn to Camp Crystal Lake, and the driver continues to accelerate. She gets scared and decides to dive out of the Jeep, and then decides to make an escape into the woods. The driver goes back and follows them into the woods, and eventually does catch Annie and kill her by cutting her throat. So Annie doesn't even make it to camp before becoming the first victim of this new group of counselors. The killer, however, does make it to the camp and begins watching the group as they are setting up a swimming dock. One of the counselors thinks they see something across the lake, but dismiss it. Ned, thinking he's the funny guy in the group, decides to play a prank, pretending he is drowned, and carries it on all the way up until the point where somebody's about to give him CPR, and it was all just a ruse to get a kiss. When Alice is back in her cabin changing, she is startled by a snake and calls Bill for help. This scene is mainly notable because Bill uses a machete to kill the snake, and a machete is a signature weapon of this series, and this is the first time it's introduced. A police officer comes by the camp and says that he's looking for Crazy Ralph, who was seen biking out towards the camp. And it turns out he was there, and he was in fact hiding in the pantry to deliver another ominous warning that if they stay there, they'll die. Crazy Ralph could be a potential suspect, but he's seen riding a bike, and the killer was driving a Jeep. Crazy Ralph just seems to live up to his name and seems to be trying to warn them away. And it is clear that they should have heeded his warning, as this is where things start to go bad for these counselors, and we lose 3 of them in quick succession. We see Ned watching Jack and Marcy, and he seems a little down, so he walks off on his own, and he thinks he sees someone walking into one of the cabins, so he follows them in. This is the end of Ned. We then see a storm blowing in, so Jack and Marcy head to the bunk room, and they decide to have some extracurricular activities. What they don't know is that they're laying on a bottom bunk, and Ned is already dead above them on the top bunk, with his throat cut. Once they finish up, Marcy heads off to the bathroom, and Jack is laying in the bed, and he's the next to get killed. It appears that the killer was hiding underneath the bunk, and they grab his head and stab him through the neck with an arrow. They then follow Marcy down to the lavatory and dispatch her with an axe. Meanwhile, the other three counselors are back at the employee cabin, playing a game of strip Monopoly to pass the time. Their game is brought to an abrupt end when a gust of wind blows the door open, scattering the pieces about a little bit, and Brenda realizes she left the windows to her cabin open and decides to call it a night and head out, leaving just Alice and Bill. We then catch back up with Steve, who's in town at a local diner. It is worth noting that Steve is a potential suspect as well, because he is driving an identical, if not exactly the same Jeep as the one that was used to pick up Annie when she was murdered. However, he is towing a trailer, and he leaves the diner to head back to camp. However, on his way back, he wipes out his Jeep in the rain and is picked up by a police officer to get a ride the rest of the way. Back at the camp, the murderers set their eyes on Brenda, first seeing her in the lavatory after she left the staff cabin, and then is watching her through the windows of her cabin as she's getting ready for bed. She begins hearing somebody calling for help out in the rain and goes outside to investigate. She follows the voice and ends up back at the archery range, and she is wandering around looking for who's there when the lights go on, blinding her, and then we hear her scream in the distance, but we don't see what happened. We go back to Alice, back in the staff cabin, who's joined by Bill. She says she thought she heard someone scream and saw the lights go on at the archery range, so they decide to go have a look around. And when looking for Brenda, they go to the cabin, and they find an ominous warning of a bloody axe on one of the beds. They then go to look for Jack and Marcy, but don't find them in their cabin either. They decide to check for everybody in the lavatory and don't find anybody still, so this is the point where they decide it's time to try to call for help. They go to the office only to find that the phone lines have been cut and they can't make a call. They try to get in a truck to leave, but can't get it to start. And Bill is trying his best to keep Alice calm. Steve is making his way back to camp still with the police officer. However, they receive a more urgent call from dispatch and have to drop him off at a crossroads so that he'll have to walk the rest of the way. As he's approaching the sign of the camp, someone shines a flashlight in his face. Although when he is able to see who it is, he does seem to know who it is. But he doesn't get a friendly greeting in return. Instead, he is the next victim. Our unseen killer then decides to kill power to the camp by shutting down the generator. Now, this may be in an attempt to draw one of them in, and it works, as Bill quickly decides to go check the generator after the lights go out. He leaves Alice sleeping in the staff cabin. We see Bill attempting to fix the generator before we go back to Alice waking up, a little startled, but she goes about her business and then decides eventually to go look for Bill. She finds him, but he's dead with an arrow through his eye stuck to a door, pinned there with multiple arrows through other parts of his body. So at this point, no more suspicion. Alice knows that somebody is here and there's a reason that her friends are missing, and she is running in a panic. She makes it back to the staff cabin and attempts to barricade herself inside. However, it's when she's in the kitchen that Brenda's dead body is flung through one of the windows. Alice sees a car coming down the driveway and she thinks it's Steve. It looks like his Jeep. So she races to go outside, only to find that it's not Steve, it's a newcomer who reveals herself to be Mrs. Voorhees, who says she's a friend of the Christies.
Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
But this is our killer. Before she reveals this to us, she goes inside and she sees the dead body and acts like she's upset about it. And then she fills in some more of the backstory. She says that the boy who died in 1957, his name was Jason, and this was her son. She said the counselors who were supposed to be watching him while he was swimming were off sleeping together, and that's why he drowned.
His name was Jason.
Said she was working as a cook for the camp at the time. We then do see that she is pretty crazy. She starts to have visions of Jason drowning in her head, calling out to her for help. And she now thinks that because Alice is a modern-day counselor, she was one of the counselors who wasn't watching Jason. And she even is talking to herself in a different voice, as though Jason is speaking to her, telling her to kill her.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her.
They have a struggle, but Alice is able to get away and makes a flee, and then she begins to discover more bodies one after the other. She decides to go try to get one of the camp rifles, but is unable to get into the bullets, and when Mrs. Voorhees catches up, they have another physical struggle, but again, Alice is able to get away and makes it back to the staff cabin and attempts to hide. She's in the pantry, and Mrs. Voorhees comes in and searches through the kitchen, and she thinks she's gone away, but then a moment later, she comes back and busts down the door to the pantry, and she comes in and attempts to attack Alice with a machete. Alice is able to hit her with a frying pan, knocking her down, and she thinks out, and she flees down to the dock where she's sitting, where Mrs. Voorhees again recovers and comes after her again with the machete. She's able to knock the machete out of her hand, and they have a long fight on the beach. Alice is able to get away and get the machete and use it to cut off Mrs. Voorhees' head, winning the fight. And then, in pure exhaustion, she just decides to get into a canoe and float out into the middle of the lake. She waits there until morning when a police car arrives and probably thinks it's finally over. And that's when Jason jumps out of the lake and pulls her in, still in the form of a child at this point. Seems like he's been waiting since 1957 for this opportunity. You might think this is the end, but then Alice wakes up in a hospital bed with doctors attempting to calm her down. The sheriff is there and he tells her that everybody else in the camp was dead, and she asks about the boy who pulled her into the lake, and they tell her they didn't find any boy, which she realizes means that he's still there. And that is the end of the first Friday the 13th movie, and the end of our first visit to Camp Crystal Lake. Now, for me, as a horror fan growing up, Friday the 13th was one of the big three series out there. Those were Friday the 13th, Halloween, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. These kind of defined horror movies for me. There are many other great horror movies from this time period. This is just three that always have stood out to me, probably because of their longevity and the franchise's ability to stand the test of time. Now, particularly with Friday the 13th, I saw some of the later movies first in the series before I went back and watched the original. So it was actually quite a shock to me to go back and watch the original and realize that Jason Voorhees wasn't the main killer. And to see that it was Mrs. Voorhees, an older woman, who was more than capable of wreaking her own havoc. And everything she does in this movie is actually pretty believable for the most part. Now, with the camp counselors she's after, you could say that they made foolish decisions. They were warned by the townspeople, and they heard that the camp was called Camp Blood, and they decided to stay there and work anyway. You can't blame them. They're young teenagers who think they're young and indestructible. They don't believe the hype, and they think that they can do whatever they want, and they're really just trying to get a job to make some money. Mrs. Voorhees goes about her killing very strategically, and let's go back to the beginning. Now, she's very angry in 1957. Of course she is. Her son drowned due to the negligence of camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake. So the next year, she comes back and kills two counselors. I don't know if they're the ones who had not been watching Jason, but she kills them when she finds them sneaking off to sleep together, as the counselors had been doing who were supposed to be watching Jason. Now, this is a much younger Mrs. Voorhees when this happens, and she caught them by surprise. Now, in the more modern Camp Crystal Lake of this movie, she is much older, but she's still quite capable, and she isolates people one by one. First, she starts with Annie. She catches her hitchhiking on the road and takes her out before she even gets to camp. And at the camp, for the others, she waits and takes her time and isolates people and waits for or creates opportunities. Ned was the lonely guy of the group, so it was natural that he wandered off on his own, so she took him out. Then she waited for Jack and Marcy to do what young teenage couples seem to do in these type of movies. They went looking for some alone time, and when they were, she first took Jack out, and then she took Marcy out when she went to the bathroom. Now, those opportunities were given to her. After this, she starts creating some opportunities. She lures Brenda out of her cabin and blinds her with bright lights at the archery range. And she kills the generator so that Bill has to come and check it out, and that's where she gets him. And she knew Steve Christie, so really she just stood there, shined a light in his face, and waited for him to get close enough to stab. He recognized her, so he wasn't worried until it was too late. The only person that she had a real struggle with was Alice. And it's clear that Mrs. Voorhees is not in touch with reality. Although with what comes later, that can't fully be said to be true. But we do see her as though she's seeing visions of Jason, and she even changes her voice as though he's giving her commands to kill these counselors. It doesn't go as planned, and Alice ends up finally being her undoing, and is the one to kill Mrs. Voorhees. But everything Mrs. Voorhees did is pretty impressive, and for an older woman, she is obviously still very physically fit and capable. She threw Brenda's dead body through the kitchen window, a feat that would be very difficult for anybody to accomplish. And then we get to Jason, because this movie's not entirely without Jason. And at first you think he's just the driving force behind Mrs. Voorhees, but no, in fact, he is, still alive, or he came back to life after his mother was killed. We don't know which, but we do see him leap out of the lake and grab Alice and drag her in. Watching this for the first time, it makes you wonder if this was meant to be inside her mind or not. Jason is still in the form of a boy. He hasn't aged since his drowning, it would seem. And the other thing is that he didn't kill Alice. He leaped up, dragged her into the lake, and then let her go. And she was pulled out of the lake by the authorities. It leaves a lot of questions, but it does set the stage for the future movies, with Jason taking the lead as the future machete-wielding killer. And that is another interesting point, that Jason's weapon of choice is a machete, the weapon that was used to kill his own mother. This movie has a lot of what 80s horror movies are known for. You have a group of promiscuous young people left in a bad situation with no adult help, and of course they one by one meet their doom. I like a lot about this movie. I think it is very well done and sets the stage for a very good franchise to come. I think the story in this movie is very well told. I had one criticism for it, is that a lot of the kills are actually done off screen.
And we see the aftermath, but we don't actually see it happen in the moment. And even for some of the ones that do, it's a very quick shot. And it does make you wonder why she had so much trouble with Alice at the end. She killed everybody else so quickly and easily, and Alice was a real struggle. But every horror movie really needs a sole survivor. In this movie, there are a total of 10 kills. There are the 2 counselors from 1958, 6 counselors in 1980, Steve Christie, and finally Mrs. Voorhees herself. Now, looking at critic scores for this movie, on Rotten Tomatoes, it got a critic score of 63% fresh and a 60% score from audiences. And over on IMDb, it gets a 6.4 out of 10 audience score. Now, this is not my favorite movie in the franchise, but I do think it is a good one. And I do find these scores to be a little bit low, surprisingly low, because although this isn't the best movie in the series, it doesn't have Jason as your main killer, which really is what draws the audiences in my opinion. But this movie is what started the franchise off. It gave it a strong start, it built a strong story that would lead to what comes next. And so for that reason, I score this movie at an 8 out of 10. Please let me know your thoughts on this horror classic in the comments section. What are your favorite parts? Is there anything you thought I missed or failed to mention? Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Keep an eye out for my next video coming soon, which will be Friday the 13th, part 2.